Between 4000 and 3000 BCE, the early Neolithic villages of the Near East that we've just been discussing start to evolve into the first city-states. City-states are sovereign states that consist of a self-ruling city and surrounding dependencies, by which I mean rural agricultural communities that surround the city and support the economic activities of the city. You can see from this map that many city-states were clustered in this region between the Tigris and the Euphrates River, this area that is on the east side of the Fertile Crescent. And this region is called Mesopotamia. And that is not the word that they had for themselves, but rather a Greek word that means the land between the two rivers. These cities emerged independently and at the same time in northern and southern Mesopotamia. And although they were independent from one another, they shared many cultural similarities. What are these cultural similarities? Well, probably the most important is that they all believed in a huge pantheon of gods, which means that they were polytheistic. And I can probably assume on your part some familiarity with Greek and Roman gods and the idea of a pantheon in which each god or goddess had their own sort of jurisdiction and their own jobs in the world of the gods. And it was sort of similar to that. All of the gods were not created equal for these religions. You had the most important gods, which tended to be nature gods, the god of victory, the god of war, the god of sex, and then you had other gods that were slightly less important, like the gods of basket weaving or leather making, or gods that were important to a particular profession. But I think what that reflects is that gods were important to every possible aspect of everyday life. And the whole idea of the separation of church and state was not something that really existed for them. It was very much intertwined with your daily activities. Everyone was expected to pray to gods and would make offerings of animals or crops to appease these gods. At the center of every city was a large structure with a shrine that would have anchored that city and would have been highly decorated in the center of everyday life. Each city-state had its own sort of favorite deity, its own protective deity, kind of like a hometown mascot, and everyone was expected to make sacrifices to that particular deity. These city-states also shared similar creation myths, even though they might have had a favorite particular god. The creation myths were fairly similar. They mostly assumed that the gods predated the creation of the earth. For example, a short tale called Marduk, Creator of the World, is a Babylonian narrative that opens with the existence of the sea before any act of creation. So we start with the creation of the sea. And then the cities are created. Then the earth is created by heaping dirt on a raft in the primeval waters. Following that, we have humankind, wild animals, the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, marshlands, vegetation, and domesticated animals. Finally, we have palm groves and forests appear. From this, we really see that it is very similar to the creation myths of many religions, including Christianity, that the God exists before the earth and is responsible for the creation of all of the major elements. In some of the images I'm showing you here, we see some of these creation myths. For example, this could be Marduk, and we see two rivers surrounding the god, and the separation of the earth from the heavens. Here's a list of the most important gods and goddesses of Mesopotamian religions. And we see Anu, the god of the sky, a very important god that will come up later. Marduk, who I just mentioned, the Babylonian creator god. But from this list of gods, you can see that the most important gods were related to nature and controlling and understanding the forces of nature. And this really makes sense in a place where your entire existence was relied on the floods of the two rivers. You were always living in fear of a flood coming and destroying your town. You were also living in fear of a drought that would dry up your crops. Unlike Egypt, and we'll talk about the importance of the Nile to Egypt. The Nile was really the backbone of Egypt. The Nile was a very predictable river with predictable flooding patterns. This was not the case for the Tigris and the Euphrates. They prayed to the gods to understand and to protect them from the forces of nature. As the city-states expanded and became more powerful, we have new roles of powerful people in the society. Remember when we talked about the Neolithic cities and the emergence of civilization, as agriculture became more predictable and there were surpluses of foods, there were roles that emerged outside of farmers and hunters and allowed for people who had jobs and roles that did not rely on simply feeding everyone. The most important of these roles were, of course, the warriors who defended people within the city-state and helped to expand its borders, the priests who were responsible for organizing religious activities, and then, of course, the rulers who were at the very top of society. We also, in this region, have the rise of the merchant class. This was an area that was very poor in terms of building materials like timber and metals. And so they relied on trade from other city-states to obtain these materials. We also have a strict social hierarchy that starts to emerge with, of course, the rulers, the warriors, and the priests at the top of this, this hierarchy, the merchants and traders below, farmers and landowners, and then finally an enslaved labor class. And the ruler becomes very powerful to keep this social hierarchy in check. How do the rulers claim power? For the most part, one claimed authority by connection with the gods. Political and religious power was very much intertwined and interrelated. So in order to be recognized as a ruler, one would have to show that a god transferred that power to them. I'm showing you here an image from the Code of Hammurabi, a sculptural relief that we'll be looking at later, in which we see this gentleman who's standing, Hammurabi, is in a conversation or in an exchange with a seated god in a throne, and this is Shamash. He's got a sort of swirly ice cream cone hat, which identifies him. And we see that he is now, he is ruling by divine authority by his connection to this god. Rulers were very much needed in a city-state to do several things. First and foremost, to organize defense, to make sure that the city-state was safe from other city-states. And this was a very tumultuous time in which one society supplanted other societies that supplanted other societies, and there was constant vying for power in this region. So defense was very important. They were also responsible for major building projects in the city, city planning, but for the most part, irrigation was the most important thing. In the floodplains, you needed to be able to control the flow of the river to farmland and create that surplus of food, which allows the civilization to thrive. The ruler also, to be a popular ruler, would also need to plan for expansion of the borders of the city-state. And this might mean not just defending the city-state, but also warring with other city-states to expand the borders and expand land. But overall, the ruler needed to maintain order and that social hierarchy. A group of city-states in southern Mesopotamia that emerged between 3500 and 2340 BCE was called Sumer. And we're not exactly sure what the origins of the Sumerians are, but they are known for three major innovations. The first is the invention of a system of writing called cuneiform. Also, the invention of the wagon wheel and the plow. We'll see that cuneiform became incredibly important in terms of this, the invention of literature and writing. And we'll talk about the first epic poem that was written in Sumer, called Gilgamesh. Cuneiform was an incredibly complicated language and needed scribes, professional scribes, to read and write in cuneiform. You'll see that it consists of these kind of wedge-shaped indentations, and I'm showing you a little tablet of cuneiform on the left. The language literally means wedge shape. The root of it is Latin, and it literally means wedge shape. And it's created with a reed stylus that is pressed into and sometimes carved into stone or clay. It starts with really a pictorial language in which a word starts with an image, and that image becomes an idea, and then that character becomes phonetic. It becomes a sound that could be used to combine with other characters to create abstract ideas. This is roughly contemporary with Egyptian hieroglyphics, and in this class we think of this as really a timeline, but that's very misleading because several civilizations that we're talking about in this time period are contemporary. And so you should really think of cuneiform as kind of the first emergence of writing and language, but very quickly it is contemporary with hieroglyphics in Egypt. With cuneiform, we have the emergence of schools that were needed to educate scribes to learn how to read and write in this system. And so the first schools emerge in Sumer in about 2500 BCE. And at first, cuneiform is used for trade and arithmetic, but quickly it starts to be used to write down a system of justice and eventually literature.